Okay, let's unpack this. We are about to embark on, I think, one of the most defining and just consequential events in all of American history, the Civil War.
Absolutely. Fought between 1861 and 1865.
Our mission today is to give you a really clear, calm, but also exceptionally thorough deep dive into this conflict. We want to trace its origins, understand its sheer complexity, and really grapple with its profound, lasting human cost.
That word thoroughness is so key. To truly get the war, we have to move beyond that simple narrative of, blue versus gray.
Right.
We have to appreciate the decades of political and cultural tension that really made this conflict, well, inevitable. But before we even get into the causes, we have to confront the scale of it all. The American crisis.
Absolutely. And the raw numbers are the place to start, I think, because they immediately put the Civil War in its own category. It is the deadliest conflict the United States has ever known.
The scale is just immense. I mean, the Union mobilized roughly 2.2 million soldiers over 4 years.
2.2 million.
Yeah. And the Confederacy, and this is incredible given its much smaller population, managed to put somewhere between 750,000 and maybe 1 million men into uniform.
That alone just tells you the level of commitment the South had to its cause.
It does.
But the casualty figures, those are the numbers that really paint the picture of devastation. For, generations, the accepted number for military dead was around 620,000. But that's been drastically updated, hasn't it?
It has, yeah. The traditional accounting, it often overlooked deaths from disease or men who were lost in camps or just poorly recorded.
Okay.
Modern research using advanced statistical analysis of census data has forced a massive recalculation. So now we estimate the total dead soldiers is somewhere between 698,000 and possibly as high as 850,000.
Wow.
And when you start to consider the civilians, the formerly enslaved people who died from hardship, from disease, from starvation, the total mortality easily goes over 1 million people.
That's a staggering jump in historical understanding. So with those new estimates, why did it take so long? I mean, what kind of biases might have existed in that earlier accounting?
Well, the initial counting was often done by the states and the federal government, and they were relying on incomplete muster rolls. They often only counted deaths that happened while someone was still officially in service.
I see.
But the biggest gap was probably cultural and systemic. The initial focus was on battle deaths and mostly on northern casualties. The South's infrastructure for record-keeping had completely collapsed, so accurate counts were almost impossible. And the sheer number of deaths from disease, that was just so hard to quantify. Men would die after leaving the hospital or on their way home. It was a crisis of mortality so vast, it just defied the record-keeping of the time.
And to put that cost into a demographic context, 8% of all white men aged 13 to 43 in the South died in this war.
8%.
Compared to 6% in the North, I mean, that level of loss shapes a society for generations.
It was cataclysmic for the South. And remember, 2/3 of those soldier deaths on both sides were from accident or disease, not combat. That hurts. We focus on the heroic charges, but the real enemy was dysentery, typhoid, smallpox, all compounded by primitive medical care and just awful sanitation in the camps.
So this really sets the stage for our mission today, tracing this conflict from its deep, deep roots in sectionalism and politics through the major campaigns and all the way to that long, incredibly difficult period of reconstruction that followed. Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. We sometimes hear arguments about tariffs or, these vague references to states' rights, but if we're looking for historical consensus, what truly drove 11 states to break away and form the Confederate States of America?
The consensus among historians today is, it's definitive. The disagreements between the slave states and the free states were the fundamental cause of disunion in the war. The issue of slavery wasn't just an issue. It was the central fault line running through American politics, really, from the moment the Constitution was drafted.
And the core debate, to be really specific, wasn't just about the existence of slavery where it already was, like in Virginia or South Carolina. It was all about the expansion of slavery into the new Western territories.
Exactly. The whole political calculus was about the balance of power. For decades, Congress tried to keep this sectional parity in the Senate by admitting states in pairs, one slave, one free.
Right, the Missouri Compromise and so on.
Precisely. But the North's population was just exploding, fueled by immigration and industrialization, and that gave them permanent control of the House of Representatives. So the entire battleground shifted to the territories.
And the Republican Party's strategy was pretty simple: containment.
Containment. The goal of the anti-slavery forces in the North was to restrict slavery's expansion.
Right.
And by doing that, putting the institution on a path to extinction.
And Southern slaveholding interests saw this as an existential threat.
Completely. A threat to their property, their economic future, their entire way of life. They argued that if they couldn't take their property, their enslaved people, into the new territories, then the federal government was infringing on their constitutional rights.
And this wasn't just some political disagreement, it reflected two completely competing ideologies. The North and South were, in a way, becoming two different nations.
They were. The Southern view was cemented in this deeply stratified agrarian society that was powered by chattel slavery. And that represented a massive capital investment worth more than all the South's railroads, factories, and banks combined.
Wow.
So white Southerners genuinely feared that emancipation would lead to catastrophic economic collapse and, critically, a race war. They were haunted by the memory of slave revolts, especially the Haitian Revolution of 1804, which led to the massacre of the white residents.
And that fear led Southern leaders to start defending slavery not as a necessary evil, but as a positive good.
Correct. They developed these sophisticated, though, of course, morally indefensible arguments. They asserted that enslaved people were somehow intellectually and morally improved by being cared for by white masters. And they denounced the Northern free labor system, with wage workers, as inferior and exploitative. They saw the North society as unstable, prone to class warfare.
But on the other hand, the North was rapidly industrializing, driven by that free labor ideology that emphasized economic opportunity, mobility, modernization. They saw the South as backward and increasingly isolated.
And in the 1850s, that decade just became this period of relentless escalation, a series of violent and legal confrontations that proved the political system just couldn't hold the nation together anymore.
Let's start with the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. How did Northern resistance to that federal law become an immediate cause of secession?
Well, the Fugitive Slave Act required federal marshals and even Northern citizens to help recapture runaway slaves. This outraged abolitionists, and they began to actively resist it. So when you read the Southern secession documents, especially from South Carolina and Mississippi, they complained bitterly that Northern states were engaging in their own form of states' rights by nullifying or resisting a federal law that protected Southern property.
So it highlights the hypocrisy, really. They demanded federal power when it protected slavery, but championed states' rights when they felt threatened by it.
Exactly. Then you get the sheer physical violence of bleeding Kansas.
Right. This was a direct result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
It was. It repealed that sacred Missouri Compromise line and introduced popular sovereignty, the idea that settlers could vote on whether a new state would be free or slave. So you had armed pro-slavery Missourians pouring over the border to vote illegally, fighting pitched battles with anti-slavery settlers.
A dress rehearsal for the Civil War.
It was a guerrilla war, lasted from 1855 to 1859, cost around 200 lives, and proved that democracy could not peacefully settle the issue of slavery.
And this breakdown of political discourse wasn't just on the frontier, it literally became physical on the floor of the Senate in 1856.
The caning of Charles Sumner. Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner gives this vitriolic crime against Kansas speech, attacking a South Carolina Senator, Andrew Butler.
Okay.
Butler's nephew, Congressman Preston Brooks, felt Sumner had insulted Southern honor. So he went to the Senate floor and beat Sumner with a cane, so severely that Sumner couldn't return to the Senate for 3 years.
Unbelievable.
Brooks became a hero in the South. He received replacement canes, accolades. Sumner became an instant martyr in the North. It was clear the political center had completely collapsed.
And then the Supreme Court delivers its own devastating blow in 1857 with Dred Scott v. Sanford.
Oh, this was a catastrophic ruling. Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled that Scott, an enslaved man seeking freedom, had no right to sue because no African-American, slave or free, could ever be a U.S. citizen.
Just a blanket declaration.
It was. And worse, Taney ruled that Congress had no power to ban slavery in the territories at all. This effectively made the entire Republican platform unconstitutional and legitimized slavery everywhere. It inflamed the North and made any kind of compromise virtually impossible.
And if anything really solidified that Southern paranoia about Northern fanatics trying to instigate a race war, it was John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859.
Brown was a deeply religious and radical abolitionist. He believed violence was the only path. His failed attempt to seize the federal armory and incite a massive slave revolt was the South's worst nightmare made real.
Right.
He was quickly captured by Colonel Robert E. Lee and hanged. But his martyrdom in the North, where bells tolled and some treated him like a saint, that convinced many Southerners that the entire North was just riddled with dangerous fanatics. It was the final psychological break.
And all of this intense polarization just sets the stage for the final trigger, the election of 1860.
The Democratic Party splits along sectional lines, which practically guaranteed a Republican victory. Abraham Lincoln, running on a platform of opposing the expansion of slavery into the territories, wins the presidency. And his name didn't even appear on the ballot in 10 southern states.
So for South, this victory just confirmed their complete and permanent loss of power in the central government.
It did, and it served as the immediate trigger for secession.
So if Lincoln's election made disunion immediate, it was really the refusal of the U.S. government to give up its federal forts that turned that disunion into an actual war. Let's trace that secession crisis.
The process started with the most radical of the slave states, South Carolina. They unanimously voted to secede on December 20, 1860.
And their declaration was pretty clear about why.
Unambiguous. It focused explicitly on the failure of the North to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act and what they saw as aggression against their right to own human beings.
And the Cotton States followed right behind them.
Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas all seceded by February of 1861. They quickly formed the Confederate States of America, and they adopted a constitution that explicitly protected slavery. And they did all this before Lincoln was even inaugurated in March.
Which brings us to Fort Sumter. This small island fort in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, that became the flashpoint for the whole thing.
It was so contentious because it was a piece of federal property deep inside seceded territory. The Union commander, Major Robert Anderson, moved his small garrison to the more defensible Sumter late in 1860. Lincoln inherited this incredibly tense standoff.
And when he was told the fort was almost out of food, he made a brilliant political move.
A masterful one. He announced he would send an unarmed ship just to resupply the fort. He guaranteed no military reinforcement would be attempted unless they were fired upon.
It was a perfect trap.
It was. If Confederate President Jefferson Davis allowed the resupply, it would validate the Union's right to hold the fort. If the Confederacy attacked an unarmed relief ship, they would be branded the aggressor, and that would mobilize Northern opinion instantly.
Davis felt he had no choice.
He felt he had no choice but to attack. He ordered General P.G.T. Beauregard to take the fort.
And in the pre-dawn hours of April 12, 1861, the first shots were fired.
After 34 hours and 4,000 shells fired by Confederate batteries, the fort surrendered. There were surprisingly few casualties, but the attack just galvanized the North. Lincoln immediately called up 75,000 state militiamen to suppress the rebellion, and that call to arms forced the hand of the Upper South.
Which triggered the second wave of secession.
Exactly. Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, North Carolina. They refused to raise troops against their fellow southern states and seceded instead. And this brought much-needed population, industry, especially from Virginia, and crucial military leaders to the Confederacy. They moved their capital to Richmond almost immediately.
But the war could have been lost right at the beginning if Lincoln hadn't managed to secure those critical border states.
Those were the slave states that bordered the Union: Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, and Kentucky. They were vital for strategic, demographic, and psychological reasons. Keeping them in the Union meant the Confederacy was smaller, and crucially, they contained vital transportation networks and rivers.
Maryland was probably the most critical of all because it literally surrounded Washington, D.C.
Its importance just can't be overstated. When Union troops tried to pass through Baltimore to get to the capital, pro-Confederate rioters attacked them and destroyed railroad bridges. The capital was effectively isolated.
And Lincoln's response was immediate and decisive.
He walked a razor-thin constitutional line.
And that's where we see the suspension of habeas corpus.
Exactly. Lincoln imposed martial law in parts of Maryland and unilaterally suspended the writ of habeas corpus, authorizing the military to arrest and detain anyone suspected of hindering the war effort without charge. He ordered the arrest of prominent pro-Confederate politicians, including over a third of the Maryland General Assembly, holding them at Fort McHenry to stop them from voting on secession.
I mean, that's a massive constitutional crisis, but it worked.
It worked. D.C. was secured.
Meanwhile, Kentucky tried to just avoid the whole conflict by declaring neutrality.
Kentucky's neutrality only lasted until September 1861, when Confederate forces violated it by entering the state. The legislature then officially voted to side with the Union, though, large numbers of Kentuckians still fought for the South.
Right.
And Missouri was just torn apart by internal civil war from the start. A shadow Confederate government challenged the elected Unionist one, leading to years of brutal guerrilla warfare. So the successful retention of those three key states, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, that was an early and decisive strategic victory for the Union.
So the war was on. But when you look past all the initial enthusiasm, the two sides were just fundamentally mismatched in terms of resources. The Union had this overwhelming advantage, even if the Confederacy had key military leaders like Robert E. Lee.
Oh, the resource imbalance absolutely dictated the long-term outcome. And this wasn't just a slight advantage. By 1860, the Union had 71% of the total population and a staggering 90% of all manufacturing capacity.
90%.
By 1864, the Union was producing 98% of all manufactures. They also had 71% of the nation's railroad miles. The North could absorb casualties and replace equipment. The South just couldn't.
So the Union's strategic blueprint for using all this power was thought up early on by General Winfield Scott, the Anaconda Plan.
Scott, who was this aging hero from the Mexican-American War, proposed a strategy of suffocation rather than a quick, bloody invasion. The plan had two major parts. First, a tight naval blockade of all southern ports to choke off their trade. And second, seizing control of the Mississippi River to split the Confederacy right in two.
And that naval blockade was implemented immediately. How effective was it, and how did it play into the Confederacy's diplomatic strategy?
The blockade was highly effective. Lincoln declared it in April 1861. And it instantly stopped regular commercial traffic because ships couldn't get insurance to dock.
Okay.
The Confederacy's whole hope was that King Cotton would force Britain and France to intervene. They thought that because their textile mills relied on southern cotton, they'd be forced to recognize the Confederacy and break the blockade. But that strategy failed utterly.
Why did King Cotton diplomacy fall flat?
A few reasons. First, Europe actually had a surplus of cotton stockpiled from a huge harvest in 1860. Second, Britain and France quickly found other sources of cotton, mainly in Egypt and India. And third, and this was the most important reason, after 1863, public opinion in Britain was overwhelmingly hostile to slavery. So intervening on behalf of the slaveholding Confederacy was just politically impossible.
Speaking of Britain, the war almost kicked off a second war with England in late 1861 over the Trent Affair. That was a really critical diplomatic moment.
It was. In November 61, a U.S. Navy warship stopped a British mail steamer, the Trent, in international waters, and forcibly removed two Confederate diplomats, James Mason and John Slidell. Britain saw this as a blatant violation of international law and a huge insult to their flag.
And London just exploded in anti-American fury. War was on the table.
It was. Britain demanded the release of the diplomats and an apology, sent 8,000 troops to Canada, and prepared the fleet. Lincoln was facing a potential two-front war he absolutely could not win.
So how did he get out of it without looking weak?
He showed incredible diplomatic savvy. He famously said, "one war at a time." He managed to smooth things over by announcing the captain had acted without orders and releasing the diplomats, but he refused to issue a formal apology. He framed their release not as caving to British demands, but as adhering to America's own principles of freedom of the seas. It was a masterstroke that averted a disastrous war.
So turning back to the fighting itself, the early campaigns showed really different results depending on where you were looking. In the Western Theater, between the Appalachians and the Mississippi, the Union made some critical permanent gains early on.
This is where we see the rise of Ulysses S. Grant, a general who really understood the concept of attrition and constant pressure. In 1862, Grant led Union forces to major victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson.
Right.
And these successes secured control of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, opening up the entire Central Confederacy for invasion. It was at Donelson that Grant demanded unconditional surrender, a nickname that just stuck with him.
He then drove towards the rail hub of Corinth, Mississippi, and fought the brutal Battle of Shiloh in April of '62.
Shiloh was a horrific shock, 23,000 casualties in just 2 days, but it solidified the Union's foothold in the West. And these early Western victories, secured by Grant, unlike the stalemates out east, they were absolutely critical to the long-term success of the Anaconda Plan. They were slowly tightening the noose.
But out east in Virginia, the war was just a grinding, bloody affair, defined by the slow, cautious command of the Union Army of the Potomac, often led by Major General George B. McClellan.
McClellan was brilliant at training and organizing the army, but he suffered from what historians call the slows. He was persistently paranoid about being outnumbered and extremely resistant to Lincoln's aggressive orders.
And that slowness allowed Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia to achieve a series of brilliant victories.
It did. And Lee, trying to capitalize on this and maybe gain European recognition, launched his first invasion of the North, the Maryland Campaign.
which led to the Battle of Antietam on September 17, 1862. It's still the single bloodiest day in American military history.
Approximately 23,000 casualties. Though technically it was a military draw, Lee was forced to retreat back into Virginia, which made it a strategic Union victory. And critically, it was the victory Lincoln had been waiting for.
And this is where we get to the most critical transformation of the entire conflict. How did the war fundamentally change from being just about preserving the Union to being inseparable from the abolition of slavery?
Well, Lincoln's initial goal was preservation. He was very cautious. He even reversed the emancipation attempts of some of his more radical generals in 1861 because he was terrified of alienating those four slaveholding border states.
Right.
He even proposed a gradual, compensated emancipation to those states, which they soundly rejected.
So what changed his mind?
The realities of the war. By mid-1862, Lincoln understood that slavery was the primary economic engine of the Confederacy. It was funding and feeding the rebel army. So striking at slavery became a military necessity that was needed to shorten the war, demoralize the South, and ensure an ultimate Union victory.
And the timing was critical. Why was Antietam so important for the Emancipation Proclamation?
Lincoln had actually drafted a preliminary version in July of '62, but his cabinet, especially Secretary of State William Seward, told him to wait. Seward argued that if emancipation was issued right after a string of Union defeats, it would look like a desperate measure from a collapsing government, not a statement of strength.
I see. So Antietam provided that necessary victory.
It did, which led to that monumental shift on January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation.
It's so vital to understand the legal scope of this. It was an executive order, right?
Right. Lincoln used his presidential war powers to declare that all slaves in rebel states, so states actively in rebellion, were free. This applied to over 3.5 million enslaved people. But it was a tactical and military document, not a legislative one.
Meaning it did not apply to the border states, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, or to the parts of the Confederacy that were already under Union control.
Exactly. It strategically freed slaves only where the Union had no power to enforce the order yet. But its impact was immediate and profound. As Union troops advanced, they became armies of liberation, and the proclamation provided a clear moral purpose to the conflict.
And what was the international impact?
It was devastating to Confederate diplomacy. The proclamation made it impossible for Britain or France to intervene on the side of the Confederacy. Doing so would mean openly supporting a slave rebellion against a nation fighting for freedom. The war officially became a war of liberation.
Politically, though, it drew a clear line. It energized the abolitionist wing of the Republican Party, but it also infuriated a lot of people in the North.
Yes, it deeply angered the Peace Democrats, or Copperheads, who wanted an immediate negotiated settlement, often based on white supremacist platforms. They argued Lincoln had turned a war for Union into an unconstitutional abolitionist crusade.
The proclamation also authorized the official enlistment of black men into the Union forces, leading to the rise of the United States Colored Troops, or the USCT.
This was revolutionary. Nearly 179,000 black men served in the Union Army and Navy. That's about a tenth of the entire Union force. Most of them, about 133,000, were former slaves from the southern states. They often faced systemic discrimination, lower pay, poorer equipment, but they fought with exceptional valor.
How did the Confederacy react to the USCT?
Oh, they were absolutely furious. Confederate leaders declared that any captured black soldiers would not be treated as prisoners of war, but would be re-enslaved or executed for treason. This led to horrific events like the Fort Pillow Massacre. Lincoln, in turn, issued orders promising retaliation against Confederate prisoners, though he was careful never to fully carry them out.
So by 1863, the military tide had really turned decisively, and we have these two massive, simultaneous blows that just confirmed that shift in momentum.
The Vicksburg and Gettysburg turning points. In the West, Grant led the successful siege of Vicksburg, Mississippi, which surrendered on July 4, 1863. This was the final piece of the Anaconda Plan. It gave the Union full control of the entire Mississippi River. The Confederacy was permanently split into a massive strategic and morale blow.
And at the exact same time, Lee's last big, aggressive invasion of the North failed at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania.
The three-day Battle of Gettysburg was Lee's attempt to crush the Union Army on northern soil, potentially forcing Lincoln to accept peace. His spectacular failure, culminating in the disastrous Pickett's Charge, cost the Confederacy irreplaceable manpower. It guaranteed the South would never again have the strength to seriously threaten Union territory.
So those two victories, just days apart, shifted the entire narrative of the war toward an inevitable Union victory. After Vicksburg and Gettysburg, the writing was on the wall. The Union reorganized under Grant, and they prepared for a hard, relentless end to the war, pivoting toward what we now call total war.
The military leadership recognized that the Confederacy was strategically defeated, but not yet destroyed. So in early 1864, Lincoln promotes Grant to General-in-Chief of all Union armies, and he puts William Tecumseh Sherman in command in the West. They shared a singular vision. Victory required the utter defeat of Confederate forces and their economic base.
And it's really essential to clarify that term total war in the Civil War context. It doesn't mean the indiscriminate killing of civilians.
Not at all. The strategy was to destroy the South's capacity to produce and transport the materials needed to keep fighting. This meant systematically targeting infrastructure, factories, and the food supply. Grant, in the East, engaged Lee in the Bloody Overland Campaign. Just a relentless series of battles designed to grind down Lee's army through attrition, knowing the Union could replace losses and the Confederacy could not.
And while that was happening, Sherman launched his devastating offensive in the Deep South.
Sherman understood that to hasten the war's end, he had to break the Southern population's will to fight. So after taking the strategic rail hub of Atlanta in September 1864, a victory that was critical for Lincoln's re-election, Sherman launched his famous March to the Sea.
Can you detail the impact of that march to the sea on the Southern infrastructure?
Sherman's army marched about 300 miles across Georgia, living off the land, seizing provisions, and deliberately destroying everything of military value in a 60-mile-wide swath. They became famous for destroying rail lines. They'd heat the rails until they were malleable and then twist them around trees into what were called Sherman's bow ties, rendering them completely unusable.
Wow.
This systematic destruction of farms, homes, railroads, it was all intended to inflict hardship and demonstrate that the Confederacy couldn't protect its own people. It was meant to collapse civilian morale and hasten the surrender.
And while Sherman was devastating the Deep South, Grant was engaged in the siege that would ultimately choke out the Confederacy in Virginia.
The 10-month siege of Petersburg. It was this complex network of trenches and fortifications that was the critical gateway to the capital, Richmond. It was a brutal preview of the trench warfare that would define World War I.
And by early April 1865, Lee had to abandon it.
His lines were too thin, his army was starving, he abandoned both Petersburg and Richmond.
And this sets the stage for the final iconic surrender.
Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was exhausted, surrounded by Grant's forces at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. Lee surrendered to Grant.
And Grant's terms were famously generous.
Extraordinarily so. And they set the precedent for a peaceful reunification. Confederate soldiers were paroled and allowed to return home. Officers were allowed to keep their sidearms and horses. Grant ordered his men not to cheer, recognizing that they were countrymen once more.
A huge moment of national reconciliation, immediately followed by national tragedy.
Lincoln lived to see the victory. He lived to see peace restored in Virginia. But he was assassinated by the Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth on April 14th, and he died the next day. It was a tragedy that deprived the nation of the one leader who was most equipped to manage the difficult task of reunifying the country.
And the remaining Confederate armies surrendered pretty quickly after Lee.
They did. The final military department disbanded on May 26, 1865. And then, legally, the insurrection was finally declared over by President Andrew Johnson on August 20, 1866. But the process of binding up the nation's wounds, well, that was just beginning.
So the victory was secured, but the cost was immense. And the fight over the meaning of that victory, what we call Reconstruction, was perhaps even more difficult and ultimately more tragic.
Oh, absolutely. The South faced total devastation. Not only was the infrastructure ruined, but the entire economic structure built on chattel slavery was instantly liquidated.
That financial loss must have been staggering.
The accumulated wealth held in enslaved people was valued at over $1,000 per healthy adult male before the war. When slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment, that capital estimated in the billions of dollars was wiped out overnight. Railroads were demolished, banks were bankrupt, cities lay in ruins. Southern income per person plummeted to less than 40% of the North's, and it stayed low for decades.
And Reconstruction, which spanned from 1865 to 1877, was the federal government's really complex effort to reunite the Union, define American citizenship, and guarantee civil rights for millions of formerly enslaved people.
And that era produced incredible legal achievements that fundamentally remade the Constitution. You have the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery in 1865, the 14th Amendment ratified in 1868, which introduced birthright citizenship and guaranteed federal civil rights, and the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, which prohibited the denial of voting rights based on race or color. These were truly revolutionary documents.
And these legal guarantees led to a profound, immediate political shift in the South as black men gained suffrage for the first time.
For a brief time, democracy really flourished in the South. You had a coalition of freedmen, Southern Unionists, derisively called scalawags, and Northerners who moved south, derisively called carpetbaggers, formed the Republican Party in the South. This coalition elected black men to local, state, and national offices, including 2 black senators and numerous congressmen. They wrote new state constitutions that established the South's first state-funded public school systems. It was a major societal improvement.
Despite all of these incredible advancements, the consensus among many historians is that Reconstruction ultimately failed. What was the central reason for the collapse of this democratic experiment?
The primary reason was the failure of the federal government to suppress widespread, systematic white Southern violence and intimidation. The political warfare began immediately. President Andrew Johnson, who took over after Lincoln's death, was a staunch white supremacist who deeply opposed the efforts of the radical Republicans, people like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, to ensure true equality. He actively obstructed Reconstruction, vetoing civil rights legislation.
And where did that white violence manifest?
Through terroristic groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the Red Shirts, and the White League. Their violence was not random. It was targeted political warfare aimed at Republicans, both black and white. They used assassinations, economic intimidation, and horrific massacres, like the Colfax Massacre in Louisiana in 1873, where White League members killed dozens, possibly hundreds, of black citizens who had surrendered.
So this was a calculated strategy to undermine black political power and drive Republican out of office, basically to reverse the gains of the war.
Absolutely. They used terror to achieve what they failed to achieve on the battlefield. And the federal government, suffering from massive corruption scandals under President Grant, and with Northern public opinion just getting weary of the constant troubles in the South, they failed to commit the necessary sustained military force to suppress this insurgency.
And the Supreme Court then played its own role in dismantling these legal achievements.
They did. Beginning in the 1870s, the Supreme Court started to severely chip away at the strength of the 14th and 15th Amendments. A case like U.S. v. Cruikshank in 1876 effectively declared that the 14th Amendment only protected individuals from state actions, not from the actions of other private citizens or terror groups. This left the federal government virtually powerless to protect black citizens from the KKK. It created a legal loophole for racial terror.
And this collapse all culminated in the Compromise of 1877.
Following the disputed 1876 presidential election, a political deal was struck. The Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, was awarded the presidency in exchange for one critical promise: the withdrawal of all remaining federal troops in the South.
And once those troops were gone,
the Reconstruction governments instantly collapsed. This led to the rapid disenfranchisement of black citizens and ushered in the brutal Jim Crow era of legal segregation and absolute white political control that lasted for nearly a century.
This tragedy leads us to the final, lingering conflict surrounding the Civil War, the battle over its memory, which was shaped by the Lost Cause myth.
The Lost Cause was this powerful, pervasive narrative created by white Southerners, and later widely accepted by the North, that served to rationalize the Confederate defeat. It portrayed Confederate leaders as heroic defenders of a noble agrarian civilization, argued that slavery was a benevolent institution and only a minor factor in the war, and suggested the war was primarily fought over states' rights.
And this myth profoundly shaped culture and excused virulent racism for generations.
Entire generations learned a version of history that romanticized the Old South. Works like Thomas Dixon Jr.'s novels, which were adapted into the incredibly influential and racist film The Birth of a Nation in 1915, glorified the KKK and demonized black political participation during Reconstruction. Later, Gone with the Wind solidified that romantic, benign view of antebellum plantation life. The acceptance of the Lost Cause facilitated North-South reconciliation among white Americans, but it did so at the direct expense of honoring why the war was fought and the freedoms that were won.
So we've covered the entire scope, from the centrality of slavery as the defining cause, the brutal fighting, the strategic necessity and moral transformation of the Emancipation Proclamation, and of course the challenging, tragic legacy of Reconstruction's collapse. The story is vast, but the central facts, I think, remain clear.
I agree. The centrality of slavery is undeniable. You just have to look at the secession documents themselves. The decisive power of the Union's industrial, demographic, and naval strength, combined with the leadership of men like Lincoln and Grant, made ultimate Union victory strategically inevitable. But the lasting tragic consequence remains the failure of Reconstruction due to sustained, unchecked political terrorism.
And this leaves us with a provocative final thought for you to consider. If the casualty figures of the Civil War were only recently recalculated to be significantly higher than we ever believed, and if historians still fiercely debate the collapse of Reconstruction 160 years later, specifically the government's failure to stop political violence and uphold the 14th and 15th Amendments, what enduring question does this still raise for you about the nature of American union and liberty?
We have to consider that the failure of Reconstruction wasn't just a historical event. It was a devastating precedent. It shows how easily democratic guarantees and newly won rights can be reversed when a government chooses to tolerate political violence and intimidation aimed at disenfranchisement. The tragic cost of the Civil War, hundreds of thousands of lives lost, was partially redeemed by the promise of the Reconstruction Amendments. A promise that was then brutally snatched away, shaping the next century of American life and proving that victory on the battlefield does not guarantee justice in the aftermath. That ongoing struggle remains the true legacy of this conflict. So, we've already spent a good amount of time unpacking the origins of the American Civil War. You know, the centrality of slavery, the political chaos, and those huge turning points like Gettysburg and Vicksburg.
Right, we've established the why and the when the tide turned.
Exactly. We know that by mid-1863, the Union had these overwhelming advantages in manpower, in industry, and especially after the Emancipation Proclamation, a clear moral high ground.
That groundwork is absolutely essential.
So our mission today is really to complete that story, and we have to tackle two things at once. First, we need to get into the nuts and bolts, the mechanics of the war, how they sustained it, the naval strategy, the final brutal campaigns.
And the second part.
And second, we have to really truly confront the staggering human cost of it all, which is so often underestimated.
And that's the central theme here, I think. It's about understanding the cost of inevitability. The Union victory was, in a strategic sense, probably inevitable given its resources.
But that inevitability came at a price.
An incredible price. The stories and the blood, the destruction, and frankly, the political failures that came right after. This wasn't just a war, it was an industrial-scale bloodletting.
Okay, let's unpack that. Let's start with Section 1, the mechanics of war and mobilization. How on earth do you put 2 million men in the North and maybe 1 million in the South into uniform and keep them there for 4 years? That initial patriotic rush to volunteer can't last forever.
It really can't. It doesn't survive the first horrifying reports of combat and, more importantly, of disease. By 1862, both sides were facing a critical manpower crisis. The whole myth of the volunteer army just fell apart.
So they had to force people to fight.
They did. The Confederacy was actually the first to bring in a national draft conscription in April of 1862. The Union followed suit about a year later, in July 1863, and that sent a clear message to everybody. This is a total war, and you don't get to just opt out.
And these draft laws, they immediately became lightning rods for class anger, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. They basically wrote inequality into law. In the South, you had these incredibly controversial exemptions.
I think I know the one you're talking about.
The most infamous was the 20 Negro law. It exempted one white male overseer for every 20 enslaved people on a plantation.
Which was sold as a way to keep the home front secure.
That was the official reason, yeah. To maintain the plantation system, which was the entire Confederate economy. But for small farmers and guys who didn't own slaves, it was just infuriating. It led directly to that bitter complaint you hear all the time: a rich man's war and a poor man's fight.
And the Union tried a different approach with commutation, but it ended up creating a very similar kind of class divide.
It did. It was the same problem with a different label. Until the middle of 1864, if you were drafted in the North, you had two legal ways out. You could hire a substitute to go in your place.
Or you could just pay a fee.
Or pay a $300 commutation fee. Now, to really get why that was so outrageous, you need to understand. $300 was basically a full year's wages for an unskilled laborer.
So an impossible amount for most people.
Completely impossible. It meant that if you were working class, you were going to war. If you were wealthy, you could just write a check.
And that kind of disparity, that had to have fueled some massive social unrest.
Absolutely, it exploded. The most famous example, of course, is the New York draft riots in 1863. You had thousands of people, mostly working-class Irish immigrants, who were furious. They were angry about being forced to fight a war for the freedom of African Americans, who they often saw as, economic competition.
And angry about that fee they couldn't pay.
And furious about the $300 out. So they just went on a rampage, burning buildings, attacking wealthy citizens, and brutally targeting African American residents. It got so bad the Union had to pull several regiments, fresh off the battlefield at Gettysburg, just to restore order in its own biggest city.
So the system itself was breeding evasion and deep resentment, and that's before we even get to desertion. The sheer misery of the war must have led to staggering numbers.
The numbers are, they're terrifying. They really show the strain on these societies. In the Union, we're talking about 280,000 soldiers who deserted.
Wow.
For the Confederacy, the situation was arguably even worse. At least 100,000 desertions, probably more. A lot of Confederate soldiers felt a stronger pull to their family, to their local community, than to this new government in Richmond. If a wife wrote and said, "The children are starving," they just packed up and went home.
And then you have that almost darkly funny category of draft evaders.
Yeah.
The bounty jumpers.
Yes, the bounty jumpers, a uniquely Civil War scam. To encourage enlistment, local and state governments started offering cash bonuses or bounties that got higher and higher.
So these guys would sign up?
They'd sign up, collect a big pile of cash, desert the next day, travel to another town, and then re-enlist under a new name to collect another bounty.
That's incredible.
It got so bad that the federal authorities eventually had to crack down hard. They ended up executing 141 of these men for fraud and desertion. It really shows you that intersection of, economic desperation and military need.
But strategically, the North had this huge demographic advantage that the South just couldn't match. And a big part of that was immigration.
Right. That was absolutely vital. That constant flow of European immigrants was the North's secret weapon for replacing its losses, especially after the bloodbaths of 62 and 63. The numbers are huge. 177,000 Germans, 144,000 Irish. For a lot of them, it was a job, plain and simple, or a fast track to citizenship.
And then came the most revolutionary mobilization of all, the creation of the United States Colored Troops, the USCT.
That was the game changer, both strategically and morally. After the Emancipation Proclamation in '63, the door was officially opened for African Americans, free black men from the North, and formerly enslaved men from the South to enlist.
And their impact was huge.
It was profound. They only made up about 10% of the Union Army, but they fought in over 400 battles. And tragically, they also accounted for 10% of the Union death toll, which tells you something about the dangerous assignments they were given and the Confederate policy of just executing them if they were captured.
But their presence completely changed the war.
It massively boosted the Union's numbers, and just as importantly, it cemented the moral purpose of the war. There was no going back after that.
Now, while all these men were on the front lines, the sources make it clear that this was a war that drew in everyone, including this sort of hidden army of women.
Women's roles were totally transformative, way beyond just being supportive on the sidelines. We know for a fact that hundreds, the estimates are somewhere between 500 and 1,000, actually disguised themselves as men and enlisted as soldiers.
And they often weren't discovered until they were wounded or killed.
Exactly. And beyond that, they served in these incredibly vital roles as spies, as nurses, as resistance activists.
And you have figures like Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, who just shattered every possible boundary.
She is an extraordinary example. She wasn't content to be a nurse. She insisted on being a surgeon. She was captured by the Confederates while treating wounded soldiers near the front lines. And she remains the only woman in history to ever receive the Medal of Honor. She just refused to accept the constraints of her time.
And the different roles women played also reflect the fundamental economic differences between the North and the South.
Precisely. In the Union, women organized these huge, almost industrial-scale aid societies to get supplies to the soldiers. But more importantly, they moved into factory jobs, government offices, preparing food, sewing uniforms. They became a crucial part of the industrial war machine.
Whereas for Confederate women, it was a much more immediate domestic crisis.
Their whole world was collapsing. With the white men gone, their primary job was to hold the plantation system together, which meant managing the enslaved workforce, which was increasingly just women, children, and the elderly. They were dealing with isolation, crazy inflation, and the constant fear that the system was about to implode.
So their letters to the government weren't just about morale.
They were petitions for survival. They begged the government to send their husbands and sons home, arguing that the threat of starvation or slave rebellion was a bigger danger than the Union Army. That was a crisis of will that really ate away at the Confederacy from the inside.
And this section closes with one of the absolute darkest chapters of the war, the prisoner crisis. The death toll in these camps was as high as some of the biggest battles.
It's an appalling story, and it's mostly a story about politics. Early in the war, there was this pretty efficient system of parole and exchange. You got captured, you were swapped for a prisoner on the other side, and you rarely spent much time in a camp.
But that all fell apart in 1863.
It collapsed completely, and the main reason was the Confederacy's refusal to treat captured black Union soldiers as prisoners of war. They saw them as escaped property or insurrectionists, not as soldiers.
So they wouldn't exchange them.
They wouldn't. And so the Union government, under Grant's direction, made a very hard choice. They stopped all prisoner exchanges until the Confederacy agreed to treat black soldiers equally.
And Grant's logic was brutal but strategic.
Exactly. He argued that even though Union soldiers would suffer terribly in these camps, continuing the exchange was basically just sending healthy, well-fed Confederate soldiers right back to these army, so he stopped it. And the immediate result was just catastrophic overcrowding in camps like Andersonville in the south and Elmira in the north.
And the human cost was just horrific.
It's staggering. Around 56,000 prisoners of war died in captivity. That's about 10% of all the deaths in the entire conflict. More men died in prison camps than died at Gettysburg and Antietam combined. It's this silent, awful testament to what happens when bureaucracy and politics fail.
And that political battle was also happening on the water. Let's transition to Section 2, Naval Warfare, the Blockade, and Diplomacy. The Union Navy's role is often overlooked, but it was really the other half of that Anaconda Plan.
The Anaconda Plan, General Winfield Scott's big idea, had two giant pincers. The first was to seize the Mississippi River, which Vicksburg accomplished. The second was to choke the Confederacy with a naval blockade. To do that, the Union Navy had to basically build itself from scratch. It went from a tiny force in 1861 to almost 700 ships by 1865.
And the war immediately forced this leap in naval technology. It pushed the whole world into the Iron Age, practically overnight.
The Civil War was a laboratory for this stuff, and the clash of the ironclads is the perfect symbol. The Confederacy, out of desperation, took the scuttled Union ship USS Merrimack and rebuilt it as this iron-plated behemoth, the CSS Virginia.
And on its first day out, it was devastating.
On March 8, 1862, it just obliterated two of the Union's biggest wooden warships at Hampton Roads. In that one afternoon, the era of the wooden fighting ship was basically over.
But the Union had a response ready to go.
They did. An incredible, almost alien-looking ship. The very next day, the USS Monitor, famously described as a cheesebox on a raft, showed up. The battle between the two was a 3-hour slugfest. Neither could really damage the other.
So it was a draw.
It was a tactical draw, but a huge strategic victory for the Union. It proved the concept, and the North immediately started mass-producing these Monitor-style ironclads, which gave them total dominance on the rivers and coastlines.
But the Navy's main day-in, day-out job was enforcing that blockade, tightening the economic noose.
And that blockade, despite covering thousands of miles of coastline, was incredibly effective. When Lincoln announced it, it instantly shut down normal commercial trade. European shipping companies just couldn't get insurance to send their vessels to Confederate ports.
Which brings us back to the South's big diplomatic gamble. King Cotton. The idea that Europe, especially Britain, needed Southern cotton so badly that they would have to intervene on the Confederacy's behalf. Why did that fail so completely?
It failed for a few critical interlocking reasons. First, there was just too much cotton in Europe already. They'd had a huge harvest in 1860 and had big stockpiles, which gave them a cushion.
So that bought them time.
It bought them time to do the second thing, which was find new sources. Britain and France quickly ramped up cotton production in their colonies in places like India and Egypt. But the third reason is the real diplomatic masterstroke. It wasn't about cotton at all. It was about the North's agricultural power. You could call it King Corn.
So King Corn beat King Cotton.
Hands down. At the same time as the Civil War, Europe was suffering from a series of terrible crop failures. They desperately needed to import food, and the Union became their breadbasket. American grain exports to Britain shot up from about a quarter of their imports to almost half.
So they couldn't risk a war with the Union.
They couldn't. It would have meant cutting off their own food supply. So Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State, brilliantly used food as a diplomatic weapon.
Okay, so if the blockade was, as the sources say, 95% effective at stopping normal trade, how did the Confederacy keep its armies in the field for 2 more years?
They relied on a very specialized kind of smuggling. They used what were called blockade runners.
These were financed by the British, right?
Yes, British investors built these small, very fast, steam-powered ships that were designed for one thing: speed. They would dash past the Union patrols, trade high-priced cotton for essential war supplies, rifles, lead, medicine, blankets, and dash back out. It wasn't enough to win, but it was just enough to keep the war going.
And then there were the commerce raiders, which took the fight to the high seas.
Right. These were also British-built ships, like the famous CSS Alabama. Their job wasn't to fight the Union Navy, it was to hunt the U.S. Merchant Marine all over the globe. And they were brutally effective.
They sank dozens of ships.
Over 60. And the effect was that insurance rates for American cargo went through the roof. A lot of American ship owners just re-registered their vessels under European flags to stay in business. It did long-term damage to the American merchant fleet.
And the fact that Britain built these ships led to a major diplomatic showdown after the war.
It did. It led to what are called the Alabama claims. The U.S. government basically said, you violated your neutrality by building these warships for our enemy, and you owe us for the damages. It was a huge international incident.
And the U.S. won.
They did. In 1871, an international tribunal ordered Britain to pay the United States $15 million in damages. It was a massive victory for American diplomacy on the world stage.
So beyond Britain and France, what was the rest of the world thinking?
Well, the European aristocracy was apparently, and I'm quoting here, absolutely gleeful at the idea of the American Republic failing. It kind of validated their whole system, but public opinion, especially among liberals, was a different story.
And the Emancipation Proclamation really changed that.
It made it impossible to ignore that the Union was fighting against slavery, and that made it very difficult for European governments to side with the Confederacy.
And then you have Russia, which was a surprisingly strong ally for the Union.
Russia was the Union's best friend in Europe. The Tsar saw the U.S. as a useful counterweight to his main rival, Great Britain, and they had the shared experience of emancipation. Russia had freed its serfs in 1861.
And they made a very public show of support.
A very visible one. In 1863, the Russian Navy sent its 2 main fleets to winter in New York and San Francisco. It was a very clear, very public signal to Britain and France. Don't even think about interfering.
And France was also distracted by its own adventure in Mexico.
Exactly. Napoleon III was sympathetic to the South, but he was also busy trying to install a puppet emperor, Maximilian, in Mexico, which was a flagrant violation of the Monroe Doctrine. The U.S. protested loudly. France knew that if they helped the South, they'd be facing a war with a unified, battle-hardened United States the minute the Civil War was over. They just couldn't risk it.
So by 1864, the naval, economic, and diplomatic pressure is just immense. This brings us to Section 3, the final campaigns, starting in the East with this brutal, grinding war of attrition between Grant and Lee.
When Grant takes command of all Union armies, he does something different. He parks himself with the Army of the Potomac in the east, and his strategy is horrifyingly simple: attrition. The Overland Campaign of 1864 isn't about capturing Richmond, it's about finding Lee's army and destroying it piece by piece.
Because Grant understood the basic math.
He understood the grim math. He knew the Union could replace every soldier it lost and the South couldn't. So you get this series of incredibly bloody battles: the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor.
Cold Harbor was particularly awful.
A catastrophe. Grant ordered a frontal assault that cost 7,000 Union casualties in about 20 minutes. But here's the difference. Any other Union general would have retreated after a disaster like that. Grant just kept going. He slid around Lee's flank and kept pushing south. His whole philosophy was, I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer.
And that relentless pressure forces Lee into the siege of Petersburg.
Right. Petersburg was the railroad junction that supplied Richmond. Grant traps Lee there, and for the next 10 months, you basically have a preview of World War I. Trench warfare, fortifications, constant skirmishing. Lee's army is pinned down and slowly starving to death.
And while Grant has Lee trapped, he sends General Sheridan to destroy Lee's food supply in the Shenandoah Valley.
Sheridan's Valley campaign is total war. Grant's orders are explicit: destroy the valley's ability to feed an army. Sheridan burns barns, mills, crops, everything. The Confederates win one last major victory at New Market, but it doesn't matter. Sheridan just regroups and finishes the job. He makes sure that even if Lee's army breaks out of Petersburg, there's nowhere for them to go.
And we need to remember, this war wasn't just in Virginia. Let's touch on the Western and Trans-Mississippi theaters to really get the scale of this.
The Western victories were what made the final push possible. Capturing Vicksburg in '63 split the Confederacy in half, and then the victory at Chattanooga opened the road straight to Atlanta into the Confederate heartland.
The Trans-Mississippi, west of the river, sounds like it was just chaos.
It was basically its own separate war. A lot of it was brutal guerrilla fighting, with guys like Quantrill's raiders committing atrocities against civilians. You even had a civil war within the Civil War among Native American tribes in the Indian Territory. About 12,000 fought for the Confederacy.
And parts of that region held out right until the end.
They did. Because the Union never managed to fully conquer it, Texas became this sort of independent fiefdom under General Kirby Smith. They called it the Kirby Smithdom. It's also where the last Confederate general to surrender, a Cherokee leader named Stan Waddy, finally gave up in June of '65.
And briefly, down in the lower seaboard, the Navy was key early on.
The capture of New Orleans in April '62 was a massive blow, taking the South's biggest port. And there was a huge focus on Charleston, the symbol of secession.
Which brings us to the 54th Massachusetts at Fort Wagner.
The attack on Fort Wagner was technically a Union defeat. But the heroism of the 54th Massachusetts, an all-black regiment that led the charge and suffered enormous casualties, became this incredible rallying cry across the North. It proved the courage and capability of black soldiers to anyone who still doubted it and spurred on recruitment for the USCT.
All of this relentless pressure then culminates in Sherman's March, a campaign designed not just to defeat the South, but to break its will to exist.
Sherman understood the new reality of the war. It wasn't just about armies anymore. It was about destroying the South's entire economic and psychological capacity to fight. His capture of Atlanta in September 1864 was the key military victory that ensured Lincoln's re-election, which killed any last hope the South had for a negotiated peace.
And then he began the march to the sea.
This was deliberate psychological warfare. His army cut itself off from its own supply lines and just lived off the land, marching across Georgia. They tore up railroads, burned factories, destroyed farms. The source material says 20% of the farms in their path were devastated. The message was clear. Your government can't protect you, and the price for this war is total ruin.
And while Sherman's cutting a scar across Georgia, the last major Confederate army in the West basically commits suicide.
That was General John Bell Hood's disastrous campaign. He invaded Tennessee, hoping to draw Sherman away. It was a catastrophic failure. His army was first crippled at the Battle of Franklin and then completely annihilated by General George H. Thomas at the Battle of Nashville. That was it. The last major Confederate field army in the West was gone.
This all sets the stage for Section 4, the definitive end. And it happened so fast in the spring of 1865.
Once Petersburg falls, it's a house of cards. Lee's army, just decimated by desertion and starvation, is surrounded after the Battle of Five Forks. Richmond, the capital, falls on April 2nd and 3rd.
And there's that incredible historical moment. The first Union troops into Richmond.
The Union XXV Corps, which was composed almost entirely of black soldiers. The symbolism is just overwhelming. Formerly enslaved men marching into the capital of the slave republic. Lee makes a desperate run west, but Grant is just constantly cutting him off.
Which leads to that iconic moment at Appomattox Courthouse.
On April 9th, 1865, Lee surrenders the Army of Northern Virginia. And the terms of that surrender are so important for what comes next.
How so?
Grant was incredibly generous. He understood the goal now was reconciliation, not punishment. So he let the officers keep their sidearms. He let the men keep their horses and mules, telling them, "You will need them for the spring planting." He forbade his own troops from cheering, reminding them, "The rebels are our countrymen again."
It was a gesture of peace.
A powerful one, but that moment of hope was almost immediately shattered.
The assassination of Lincoln.
5 days later, John Wilkes Booth shoots him on April 14th, and he dies the next morning. And in that moment, the country loses the one leader who might have had the moral authority and the political skill to navigate the incredibly difficult process of Reconstruction. The loss is just immeasurable.
And Appomattox, as famous as it is, wasn't the end. The war had this long tail of surrenders.
That's right. The biggest surrender was actually General Joseph Johnston's Army of Tennessee to Sherman on April 26th. That was nearly 90,000 men. The very last military department, the Trans-Mississippi, didn't officially disband until May 26th.
And we can't forget the very last general.
Brigadier General Stan Waddy, the Cherokee leader, on June 23, 1865.
Which brings us to that crucial moment when freedom finally reached the last enslaved people in Texas, the moment we now celebrate as Juneteenth.
On June 19, 1865, a Union general, Gordon Granger, arrived in Galveston, Texas, and read General Order No. 3, which officially enforced the Emancipation Proclamation there. Because Texas was so remote, slavery had continued for months after Appomattox. Juneteenth marks that tangible, real end of human bondage in the Confederacy.
But the war itself, legally, wasn't over for another year.
The official legal end of the insurrection came on August 20th, 1866, when President Andrew Johnson issued a proclamation. The paperwork, as always, took a while to catch up with the reality on the ground.
And that reality brings us to the most sobering part of our deep dive. Section 5, the staggering human toll. And we really have to start with the revised casualty figures, which are just mind-blowing.
This is where modern history has completely changed our understanding. For 100 years, the number everyone used was about 620,000 military deaths. But that number was based on, frankly, terrible record keeping, especially from the collapsing Confederate government.
So new statistical methods have given us a much more accurate and much more horrifying number.
They have. A big study in 2011 using census data pushed the estimate way up to between 750,000 and 850,000. The most recent calculation from 2024 has refined that a bit to around 698,000.
But the takeaway is the same. The old number was way too low.
Way too low. We're talking about a war where the death toll in American lives is comparable to all of America's other wars combined, right up through Vietnam.
And if you break that down demographically, for the South, it was a cataclysm.
It's a demographic scar that's hard to even imagine. Nationally, about 8% of all white men between 13 and 43 died. But in the South alone, that number is 18%.
1 in 5.
Almost 1 in 5 young Southern white men did not come home. That level of loss just hollowed out a generation and crippled Southern society for a century. The South's per capita income fell to less than 40% of the North's. That economic devastation is a direct legacy of this human devastation.
And we have to keep hammering in this home. The biggest killer wasn't combat, it was disease.
We always focus on the battles, but 2/3 of all military deaths were from disease. Dysentery, typhoid, smallpox. We're talking about 224,000 Union soldiers and 164,000 Confederate soldiers who died in filthy, overcrowded camps without basic sanitation or medical knowledge.
The prison camps were just incubators for that.
With 56,000 men dying in captivity, they were some of the deadliest places in the entire world.
But the count doesn't even stop there. We have to include the uncounted victims, the formerly enslaved population.
This is the hidden tragedy that likely pushes the real death toll over 1 million. We have tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of formerly enslaved people who died from starvation and disease after escaping to Union lines. The Union Army was an army of liberation, but it had no idea how to care for a massive refugee population. The contraband camps they set up often became death traps.
And this incredible casualty rate was a direct result of military technology getting way ahead of military tactics.
It's the classic story of industrial warfare. You have generals using tactics from Napoleon's era, marching men in neat lines across open fields, but they're marching into weapons of a completely different lethality. The main culprit was the mini-ball.
And what made the mini-ball so different?
Older muskets fired round balls that were inaccurate. The mini-ball was conical, and it was fired from a rifled barrel, which made it accurate over much longer distances. But the real horror was what it did on impact. Because it was soft lead, it didn't just pierce, it flattened and shattered bone and tissue, creating these massive, untreatable wounds.
So a wound that might have been survivable in an earlier war now meant amputation.
Almost certainly. And with primitive medical care, that was a death sentence for many. You end up with 60,000 soldiers who lost a limb and created this huge population of disabled veterans.
And finally, just to get a sense of the sheer scale of destruction, there's the death toll of the animals.
The logistics of these armies moving cannons, wagons, supplies ran on horsepower. The estimates are that over 1 million horses and mules died from combat, disease, and starvation. It's just another indicator of the unbelievable resource consumption of this conflict.
And that profound, horrifying cost leads us right into our final section, memory and historiography. How did a defeated South make sense of all this devastation?
They created a story, a powerful, pervasive, and deeply misleading story that we now call the Lost Cause myth. It was an ideology designed to rationalize defeat, reshape the narrative of the war, war and justify the reimposition of white supremacy.
What were the main pillars of that myth?
There were a few core tenets. First, that the Confederate cause was heroic and just, led by God-fearing men like Robert Lee. Second, that the war was not about slavery at all, but about the noble principle of states' rights. Third, that slavery itself was a benevolent institution, or at least wasn't the real issue. And fourth, that the South only lost because it was overwhelmed by the North's brute industrial strength, not because its cause was wrong.
And the real tragedy is that this myth actually worked. It helped reunite the country, at least for white Americans, but at a terrible cost.
It was a national bargain. For the North and South to reconcile, the North had to tacitly agree to forget why the war was fought. It meant ignoring the virulent racism of the lost cause and abandoning the promises of equality, the 14th and 15th Amendments that had been made to black citizens during Reconstruction.
And popular culture cemented this myth in the American mind.
Absolutely. It gained incredible power through movies. You had The Birth of a Nation in 1915, which is just horrifically racist and portrays the Ku Klux Klan as heroes. And then, more subtly, you had Gone with the Wind in 1939, which created this romantic, nostalgic vision of the Old South that has been incredibly hard to shake.
But on a more positive side, the sheer scale of death in the war also created our modern tradition of battlefield preservation.
It did. The need to honor the dead began almost before the fighting stopped. The very oldest surviving monument was actually built during the war in 1863 by Union soldiers in Tennessee to mark the graves of their comrades.
And that impulse led to our national park system.
In the 1890s, the government set aside 5 of the major battlefields: Gettysburg, Vicksburg, Shiloh, and others. They were eventually turned over to the National Park Service, which preserved the physical ground even as the battle over its meaning continued to rage.
Let's end on that idea of industrial war. What are the big technological legacies here?
The Civil War was the moment that proved industrial might wins modern wars. So many technologies that would define the 20th century were used on a massive scale for the first time.
It's like a checklist for the future.
It really is. You have the strategic use of railroads to move troops and supplies. You have the telegraph for instant command and control. You have steam-powered ironclad warships. You even have aerial reconnaissance with hot air balloons.
And as we talked about, the weapons themselves were a huge leap forward.
A deadly leap. The mass production of repeating rifles like the Spencer and the Henry gave Union soldiers a massive firepower advantage. And you see the debut of early machine guns like the Gatling gun. All that lethality, combined with those outdated tactics, led directly to the carnage and the necessity of trench warfare. It was a terrifying dress rehearsal for World War I.
So if we pull all of this together, the origins, the industrial scale, the final brutal campaigns, and its heartbreaking human cost, what are the 2 big central lessons that stand out from this entire deep dive?
It's a paradox, really, and you have to hold both ideas in your head at once. The first lesson is the strategic inevitability of it. It was driven by industry, by demographics, and ultimately by the moral power of the Emancipation Proclamation.
But the second lesson is the cost of that inevitability.
Exactly. The second lesson is that this victory came at a price that is almost beyond comprehension, possibly over 1 million dead, when you include civilians and former slaves, and that even that victory was immediately undermined by the catastrophic failure of Reconstruction.
And that failure of Reconstruction is maybe the hardest part of this whole story. We focus on the battles, but that period right after the war defined the next 100 years.
It did, and it's so important to understand why it failed. The war was fought, and the 14th and 15th Amendments were passed, promising real liberty and equality. But that promise was broken. The failure of Reconstruction proves how easily newly won rights can be stripped away if political violence is allowed to go unchecked.
And why was it allowed to go unchecked?
It was a perfect storm. You had national exhaustion after the war. You had Lincoln's assassination, which removed the one person who could have managed it. And you had a desire among white Americans, North and South, to just reconcile and move on. So crucially, the federal government pulled its troops out of the South.
The troops who were protecting black voters.
Exactly. Without that federal protection, violent groups like the Ku Klux Klan were able to use terror to systematically dismantle every gain that had been made. The Compromise of 1877, which officially ended the military presence, was the final nail in the coffin.
So the human cost of the war didn't actually purchase the equality it was supposed to.
It bought the constitutional amendments, but the national will to enforce them vanished, and that resulted in another century of racial oppression. It's a tragic lesson that legal rights mean nothing without the political will to protect them.
Which sets us up for our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to take away. If the true casualty count of the Civil War is so much higher than we ever thought, and if we're still fiercely debating the collapse of Reconstruction, specifically the failure to stop political violence and uphold those new amendments, which part of this conflict do you think still exerts the strongest, most unexamined influence on America today?
I'd argue that the ongoing battle over the Civil War's memory is really just a proxy war for